In the unforgiving Montana frontier of 1892, when a woman breaks her leg and can't work, she becomes expendable. But when the townspeople abandon Sarah Whitmore as a burden they can't afford, a mysterious, half-Mexican cowboy makes a choice that defies every rule of frontier survival. This is the extraordinary true story of what happens when one person refuses to accept society's cruelest judgments. Hit that like button, share what draws you to stories of unexpected heroism in the comments, and subscribe for more incredible true stories. Now, let's begin with Chapter 1. The October wind cut through Silverbrook like a blade, carrying the bitter promise of early winter. In the back room of Henderson's general store, 23-year-old Sarah Whitmore lay on a narrow cot, her left leg twisted beneath a threadbare quilt. The break had happened 3 weeks ago when her horse stepped in a prairie dog hole. "Bones not setting right," Doc Morrison muttered to Thomas Henderson. "She'll never walk proper again, might not walk at all." Henderson wiped his hands on his apron. "Can't keep her here through winter, Doc. Got barely enough supplies for folks who can work. She's got no family, no way to contribute." Through the thin wall, Sarah heard every word. She'd been hearing variations of the same conversation for days, spoken by people she'd considered friends, neighbors, community. The verdict was always the same. She was broken goods, a burden the struggling settlement couldn't afford. Sarah had arrived in Silverbrook 2 years earlier, one of the few unmarried women brave enough to answer the call for settlers. She'd worked harder than most men, helping build cabins, tend livestock, manage the store's inventory. But now, with her leg shattered, all of that counted for nothing. "There's talk of taking her down to Millfield before the passes close," Henderson continued. "Leave her at the church there. Young Patterson might do it for the right price." Sarah closed her eyes, fighting tears. Patterson was barely 19, with a reputation for shortcuts and avoiding hard work. The thought of being hauled through treacherous mountain passes by someone who saw her as nothing more than a payday made her stomach churn. The bell above the door chimed, and both men's voices dropped to whispers. Sarah strained to hear but could only make out the heavy sound of boots and low murmurs. "Ma'am? Miss Whitmore?" The voice was unfamiliar, deep and quiet. Sarah opened her eyes to find a tall figure in the doorway, hat in hand. The man was perhaps 30, with dark hair and storm-grey eyes. His clothes were worn but clean, and everything about him suggested competence and quiet strength. "Name's Jonathan Mesa," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Folks call me John. I heard you might be needing help." Sarah struggled to sit straighter. "I'm not sure what kind of help you mean, Mr. Mesa." "Heard there's talk of moving you before winter sets in. Millfield, they're saying." "That's what they're discussing, yes." 4 days through Henderson Pass," John continued. "Rough country even in good weather, rougher still with winter coming on." John was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. "I know those mountains, Miss Whitmore. Every trail, every shelter. Been crossing them for near 15 years now." "Are you offering to take me to Millfield?" "No, ma'am. I'm offering to take you across the mountain to my place. Small cabin, decent spread for horses and cattle. It's warm, safe, and there's room for someone who needs a place to heal." Sarah stared at him. "Your place? But why would you? You don't even know me." "Don't need to know your whole story to see you're being treated wrong. This country's hard enough without folks turning their backs when times get tough." Before Sarah could respond, Henderson appeared in the doorway. "Mesa, wasn't expecting to see you. Thought you kept to yourself up on that mountain." "Usually do. Came down for supplies. Heard you folks had a problem that needed solving." Henderson's eyes narrowed. "Not sure I'd call it a problem, just practical planning for winter." "Seems to me Miss Whitmore contributed plenty before her accident," John said quietly, steel beneath the soft words. "Heard she helped build half the cabins here, managed your books too. That's all well and good, but now she's inconvenient, I understand. Lucky thing I've got room for inconvenient folks. Henderson clearly wanted to argue, but he also wanted Sarah gone before winter. After a moment, his practical nature won out. Well, if you're willing to take responsibility for her, that's your business. John turned back to Sarah. Don't have to decide right now, but I'll be in town another day getting supplies. Weather's holding but won't much longer. If you want to come with me, I'll make sure you get there safe. Why are you doing this? Really? John was quiet so long Sarah wondered if he'd answer. When he finally spoke, his words carried old pain. Sometimes people get called things they're not. Sometimes they get left behind when they shouldn't be. Sometimes a person who's been there knows better than to let it happen again. He touched his hat brim. I'll be at the livery stable come morning, if you decide you want to take that ride. As his footsteps faded, Sarah stared at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, she felt something other than despair. It wasn't quite hope, but it was possibility. Dawn broke grey and cold over Silverbrook. Sarah had spent the night staring at the ceiling, her mind churning through possibilities and fears. By the time pale sunlight filtered through the window, she'd made her decision. Doc Morrison appeared in the doorway, carrying his medical bag. You're up early, how's the pain? Manageable, Sarah lied. Heard Mesa made you an offer yesterday. That's unexpected. You know him? Doc Morrison nodded. Known of him for years. Keeps to himself, but he's got a reputation for being fair, honest, reliable. He paused. Also heard he's got reasons for understanding what it's like to be judged unfairly. What do you mean? The doctor glanced toward the main store, ensuring privacy. John Mesa's got Mexican blood. Father was a vaquero. Mother was a settler woman. That kind of heritage doesn't always sit well with folks. Sarah felt a chill. She'd heard the casual prejudice that frontier communities harbored against anyone who did not fit their narrow definition of acceptable. The fact that John had offered to help, despite knowing he might face criticism, made his gesture even more remarkable. Doc, what do you really think about my leg? Doc Morrison was quiet, checking her splint. Bones healing, but crooked. You might walk with a limp. Might need a cane, might get around fine given time and proper care. He met her eyes. What I know is staying here isn't going to give you the best chance. Because I'm a burden. Because this place is dying, Sarah. The mine played out, the railroad passed us by. Every winter we lose more folks. Henderson's holding on by his fingernails, and that makes people desperate. Desperate people don't have room for charity. Before Sarah could respond, familiar boots crossed the floor, followed by Henderson's voice. Morning, Mesa. Figured you might be by early. Morning, come to check on Miss Whitmore. Well, that's between you and her. I've got your supplies ready. Coffee, flour, beans, salt pork, medicines you asked for, $18.40. Sarah heard coins being counted, supplies loaded, the practical sounds of a man preparing for winter in isolation, but who had found room for a broken woman he barely knew. Miss Whitmore, may I come back? Yes, Sarah called. John appeared, hat in hand. Sleep on it? I did. If the offer still stands, I'd like to come with you. Something shifted in John's expression, a subtle relaxation of tension. Offer stands, but I want to be straight about what you're agreeing to. It's a hard journey. 2 days through mountain country if weather holds. You'll be in pain, and there won't be much I can do until we reach my place. I understand. Do you? Because once we start up that mountain, there's no changing your mind. You'll be depending on me completely, and I'll be depending on you to trust me to know the way. The gravity settled over Sarah like a heavy blanket. She was proposing to cross dangerous territory with a man she'd known less than 24 hours. It was an enormous risk. It was also her only real choice. I understand. When do we leave? Soon as I get you loaded and the horses hitched. I can smell snow coming. John returned with a thick wool blanket and leather traveling bag. "Mrs. Henderson put together some things for you. Blankets from me. You'll need it." With careful teamwork and gritted teeth, they got Sarah to John's wagon. He'd lined the bed with hay and blankets, creating a cushioned nest. As he settled her comfortably, Henderson watched from the doorway. "Miss Whitmore," Henderson called as John climbed onto the driver's seat. "This isn't personal. It's just the way things have to be." Sarah looked at the man who'd employed her, shared meals with her, relied on her for 2 years. "I know, Mr. Henderson. I hope you all make it through the winter." John clicked to his horses, and the wagon lurched into motion. As Silverbrook fell away, Sarah felt an odd mixture of loss and liberation. She was leaving the only community she'd known in Montana, heading into unknown country with a near stranger. Her leg throbbed with every bump, but for the first time in weeks, Sarah felt like she was moving towards something instead of being discarded. The silent cowboy beside her had seen her as more than a burden. He'd seen her as a person worth saving, and that recognition felt like the beginning of hope. The wagon climbed steadily through the morning, leaving the valley floor as John guided his horses along a narrow trail that switchbacked up the mountainside. Sarah tried to focus on the spectacular scenery rather than the pain shooting through her leg with every jolt. Ponderosa pines towered on either side, their branches forming a canopy that filtered sunlight into dancing patterns. Below, the valley spread out like a map, with Silverbrook already looking like toy buildings. Above, mountain peaks stretched away, their summits dusted with snow warning of winter's approach. "How often do you make this journey?" Sarah asked. "Few times a year. Spring for supplies, summer if needed, fall to stock up for winter. Sometimes I go months without seeing another soul. Doesn't that get lonely?" John was quiet so long Sarah wondered if he'd heard. When he answered, his voice was thoughtful. "Used to think it did. But there's a difference between being alone and being lonely. Alone is circumstances. Lonely is when you're surrounded by people who don't see you for who you really are." Sarah considered this. She'd felt desperately lonely in Silverbrook these past weeks, surrounded by people who'd reduced her to a problem. But here, traveling through wilderness with this quiet man, she felt less alone than she had in months. "What made you choose this life?" John's hands tightened on the reins. "Didn't start as a choice. After my father died, my mother moved back east. I was 16 and half Mexican in mining country. Wasn't easy finding places that would have me." "So you went up the mountain?" "Started trying to get away from places where folks saw problems instead of possibilities. Found an abandoned cabin, fixed it up, started running cattle. Turned out I had a knack for it, horses especially." The trail narrowed as they climbed higher, forcing John to guide carefully around rocky outcroppings. Sarah could see his competence in every decision, when to rest the horses, when to push forward, how to read signs of safe versus dangerous terrain. "John, can I ask something personal?" "Can ask. Might not answer." "When you offered to take me, did you think about what people might say? About an unmarried man and woman living under the same roof?" John navigated a treacherous section before responding. "Thought about it. Decided I cared more about doing what was right than what people might think. Besides, not many people around to do the talking where we're going." As the day wore on, the trail grew steeper. John stopped frequently to rest the horses, checking on Sarah and adjusting her blankets. His care was practical rather than sentimental, but there was genuine concern in his manner. During one rest stop, as they sat while the horses grazed beside a stream, John suddenly went very still. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Weather," John said simply, but with new tension. "See those clouds building over the North Ridge? That's snow, and it's moving faster than I'd like." Sarah saw a wall of grey-black clouds rolling over the peaks like a slow wave. The temperature seemed to drop as she watched, wind picking up and sending pine needles skittering. "How far to your place?" Better part of a day's travel in good weather. John was already moving, checking harnesses and securing supplies. We're going to have to push harder than I'd like, get caught in a snowstorm up here, and we won't make it to shelter. The urgency in his voice chilled Sarah. She'd heard stories of travelers found frozen where they'd tried to take shelter. The wilderness around them, beautiful moments before, suddenly felt hostile. John climbed back up and clicked to the horses, pushing them faster. The wagon bounced violently, sending spikes of pain through Sarah's leg, but she bit down complaints. She could see strain in John's shoulders, the way his eyes constantly scanned trail and sky, calculating with desperate precision. "There's a way station 2 hours ahead," John called over increasing wind. "Old Trapper's cabin. If we can make it there before the snow hits hard, we can wait it out." But even as he spoke, the first fat snowflakes began to fall, melting instantly on the warm rocks, but promising worse to come. The temperature plummeted, and Sarah pulled her blankets closer as the mountains showed them exactly how quickly weather could turn deadly in the high country. John pushed the horses as fast as he dared on the treacherous trail, racing against a storm that could trap them in the open with no shelter and no hope of survival. The snow fell harder with each passing hour, transforming the mountain trail into a treacherous ribbon of white that seemed to disappear into nothingness just yards ahead of the wagon. John hunched forward on the driver's seat, his hat brim heavy with accumulated snow, squinting through the swirling flakes as he guided his increasingly nervous horses along what he hoped was still the path. Sarah could no longer feel her fingers, despite the thick blankets wrapped around her. The cold bit through every layer of clothing, turning her breath to vapor that froze almost instantly in the bitter air. But worse than the physical discomfort was the growing realization that they were in genuine danger. The cheerful autumn journey had become a desperate race for survival. "There!" John's voice cut through the howling wind, relief evident even in that single word. Through the blowing snow, Sarah could make out the dark outline of a small log structure nestled against a rocky outcropping. "The way station. We made it." John coaxed the exhausted horses the final 100 yards to the cabin, then quickly unhitched them and led them to a lean-to shelter attached to the building's side. Sarah watched him move with practiced efficiency despite the brutal conditions, securing the animals and unloading essential supplies before the storm could worsen further. "Can you make it inside if I help you?" John asked, appearing at the side of the wagon. Snow clung to his dark hair and eyebrows, making him look like some mythical winter spirit. "I think so," Sarah replied, though she wasn't entirely certain. The cold had stiffened her injured leg, and she hadn't moved from the wagon bed in hours. With infinite care, John lifted her from the wagon and carried her through the cabin's heavy wooden door. The interior was simple but solid. One room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a pair of narrow bunks built into the walls. More importantly, it was shelter from the storm that now raged outside with full fury. John settled Sarah on one of the bunks, then immediately set about building a fire. Within minutes, flames crackled in the hearth, beginning to push back the bitter cold that had followed them inside. As warmth gradually returned to the small space, Sarah felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "How long will we need to stay here?" she asked. John glanced toward the single window, where snow now fell so thickly that the world beyond had disappeared entirely. "Storm like this? Could be hours, could be days. Mountain weather's unpredictable, especially this time of year." "Days?" Sarah felt a flutter of panic. Being stranded with John had seemed manageable when she'd imagined a few hours' delay, but days alone together in this tiny cabin was something else entirely. "Don't worry," John said, seeming to read her thoughts. "I've got enough supplies for both of us, and this place is stocked with emergency provisions. We'll be fine." As if to prove his point, he began methodically arranging their supplies: coffee, dried meat, beans, hardtack, and a precious small bag of sugar. From the cabin's existing stores, he added canned goods and a few other essentials left by previous travelers. It wasn't luxury, but it was sustenance. Over the next few hours, as the storm continued to rage outside, Sarah found herself observing John more closely than she'd been able to during their journey. Away from the need to constantly watch the trail and manage the horses, he seemed to relax slightly, though she noticed he still moved with the quiet economy of motion that marked him as someone completely comfortable in wilderness settings. "John," she said during a lull in the wind's howling, "you said yesterday that you understood what it was like to be judged unfairly. Will you tell me more about that?" John looked up from the coffee he was preparing, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight. For a moment Sarah thought he wouldn't answer, but then he settled into the chair across from her bunk and began to speak. "My father, Miguel Mesa, came north from Sonora when he was barely 20. He was following the cattle drives, working as a vaquero for ranchers who needed men who understood horses and weren't afraid of hard work. That's how he met my mother. She was cooking for one of the outfits he rode with." John paused to pour coffee into 2 tin cups, handing one to Sarah before continuing. They fell in love, got married, and tried to build a life together. But being a mixed couple in the 1860s, well, it wasn't easy. Couldn't settle in the Mexican communities because she was Anglo, couldn't settle in the Anglo communities because he was Mexican. So they kept moving, looking for a place that would accept them both. Did they find it? For a while. They ended up in a little mining town called Cedar Falls, maybe 50 miles south of here. Miguel worked the mines. My mother took in washing and sewing. I came along in 1862, and for a few years things were good. The town was growing, people were making money, and when times are good, folks tend to be more tolerant. John's expression darkened. But when the easy silver played out and times got hard, people started looking for someone to blame. The Mexicans were taking jobs from real Americans, they said. The mixed families were corrupting decent society. The usual complaints. What happened? Started with little things. Harassment, name-calling, jokes that weren't funny. Then someone's tool went missing from the mine, and naturally it was Miguel who must have stolen it. Someone's daughter got pregnant by a boy she shouldn't have been with, and naturally it was because the presence of those people was corrupting the town's morals. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather outside. She'd heard similar stories before, but never from someone who'd lived through them. "My father was proud," John continued, "too proud to leave when he should have. He kept thinking that if he just worked harder, proved himself more completely, people would come to accept us. But fear and prejudice don't respond to logic or fairness." How did it end? John was quiet for so long that Sarah wondered if she'd pushed too far. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made her heart ache for the boy he'd been. "Vigilante committee decided the town would be better off without Mexican influence. Gave all the Mexican families 3 days to pack up and leave. Most did. My father decided to make a stand, said he was an American citizen, had every right to stay, wouldn't be driven off by ignorance and fear." "Oh, John, they came at night. Burned our house, ran off our livestock, beat my father bad enough to put him in bed for 2 months. Made it clear that if we didn't leave immediately, next time they'd do worse than just beat him." Sarah reached out instinctively, covering John's hand with hers. His skin was warm from the coffee cup, but she could feel the tension in his fingers. "So you left." "So we left, loaded what we could salvage into a wagon and headed north. But my father was never the same after that beating. Something broke inside him that never healed. He died of pneumonia 2 years later, but I think he really died that night in Cedar Falls, when he realized that all his hard work and good intentions couldn't overcome other people's hatred." The cabin fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire and the continued howling of the wind outside. Sarah struggled to find words adequate to the story John had shared. That's why you understood, she said finally, about being called something you're not, being left behind when you shouldn't be. John nodded. I've spent my whole life watching good people get thrown away because they didn't fit someone else's idea of what was acceptable. My father because of his blood, you because of your injury. It's all the same poison, just different excuses. Sarah felt tears threatening. But you saved yourself. You found a way to build a life despite all that. Took me years to understand that their judgment said nothing about my worth and everything about their character. Longer still to realize that sometimes the best thing you can do is build something good for someone else who's facing the same choice I faced. Is that what you're doing? Building something good for me? John met her eyes directly. Trying to. Figure you deserve the chance to discover what you're capable of when you're not spending all your energy proving you're not broken. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, Sarah felt something warm and precious taking root in her chest. For the first time since her accident, she began to believe that maybe, just maybe, being broken wasn't the end of her story. It was just the beginning of a different one. Thank you, she said simply. John smiled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. Thank me when we get you across this mountain and you've had time to heal proper. We've still got a ways to go. But as Sarah settled back against her pillow, listening to the storm and watching the firelight play across John's face, she realized that in some ways the most important part of her journey was already complete. She'd found someone who saw her not as a burden to be discarded, but as a person worthy of rescue, care, and hope. The mountain would test them both before they reached John's cabin, but Sarah was no longer afraid. She was traveling with a man who understood that sometimes the most heroic act was simply refusing to abandon someone the world had given up on, and sometimes that was enough to change everything. If this story of unexpected heroism and second chances moved you, please hit that subscribe button and like this video. Share in the comments what acts of kindness have made a difference in your life. These stories remind us that even in the harshest circumstances, human decency can triumph over cruelty. Thank you for watching, and remember, you never know when you might be someone's John Mesa, the person who refuses to leave another human being behind.